Hello, I'm Robin. Welcome to Bookspin. It's time for another SF book review trio. This is actually my first book review video for this year. So I'm going to talk about 3 of the books which I read last month. So I actually read 6 books in January, but I've got 3 books I'm going to talk about today. So let's dive right in. And the first book I read this year was No Enemy But Time by Michael Bishop. Okay, so this book was published in 1982, and it was brought to my attention by Alistair Reynolds as one of his recommended reads. In fact, he wrote the introduction to this edition, and I think it's a bit of an underrated classic. I think it did win the Nebula Award, but it's not a book which I hear people talking about. It doesn't seem to get mentioned much on BookTube, although Ira from SF Words of Wonder gave it a pretty glowing review a few months back last year. So anyway, this is a really interesting and unique time travel novel. The central premise involves a secret government research project called the White Sphinx Project, which is a kind of grand paleo-anthropological experiment in which a man is sent back in time over 1 million years into the prehistoric past of East Africa in the Pleistocene era. So he's sent back in time from the 1980s to the primeval past, and it's there that he comes into contact with a small band of archaic humans of the species Homo habilis, and he integrates with their group and he learns of their way of life. So it's a really fascinating premise, and it's done in a very compelling way. So the man who is the protagonist of this book is called Joshua, and he's the POV character. He's a very interesting character. He's a young African-American man, and he has quite a complicated past. So he was born in Spain into poverty, quite desperate poverty, and then he was adopted by American parents after he was given away by his birth mother. So half of the novel explores his backstory and basically his childhood and his growing up. And this is alternated with the time travel chapters. So the backstory chapters are told in the third person, and they're not always in chronological order. So it's quite interesting. It's a quite an absorbing character study. And I think this part of the book, this half of the novel, reads more like literary fiction than SF. And then these chapters alternate with the other part of the story in which he goes back in time to prehistoric Africa. And this narrative reads very differently. It's told in the first person. I think it has a bit more of an intimate feel to the narration. And it's kind of written like a diary, in which we learn about Joshua's interactions with the Habilines and his attempts to get accepted by their group and the challenges that he faces and that the group face living in the ancient African savannah. So that's the basic premise. I really enjoyed this book. I think it has a lot going for it. I think it's got 3 main strengths that make for a very captivating read. First up, the premise is really intriguing. I don't think I've seen a time travel explored in this way before. And I think the lives of prehistoric humans is a really fascinating field of study. It's mankind's heritage, not just for modern day humans, but for all of the now extinct species of humanity. And this book speculates on how these people may have lived This is all before we had agriculture, before we had civilization. And it's a branch of humanity which is now extinct. So the idea of getting to know some of these people in person is kind of the ultimate dream for the paleoanthropologist. So this book is not just a time travel story, it's also a first contact story in a sense. Secondly, I think the character building is very rich. Joshua is quite a complex and interesting person, and his past and his relationships with his family are explored in a very compelling way. So as the novel progresses, you get a better understanding of why he was chosen for this project to be sent back in time and why he accepted this assignment. And this whole experience is constantly foreshadowed throughout his childhood because he has these recurring dreams of prehistoric Africa. And this is a phenomenon that he calls spirit traveling. The Haberleans themselves, the ancient humans, are also quite fascinating, as you might expect. Their way of life is very different, a whole world away from modern human society, but they are presented in a very intelligent and compassionate way. So as a reader, you really care about them. So very strong character work throughout. But I think also, one of this book's main strengths, I think, is the quality of the prose, right? Michael Bishop is a very talented wordsmith, and it really comes across in this book. He's very articulate, very expressive, and also pretty witty. There's a lot of humour in this book. He doesn't overdo it, but I think he does successfully add a layer of wit throughout the narrative, which without it would otherwise be quite a heavy and sober read, because there are some pretty tough themes. So I think all of these elements add up to make a really great read. I can definitely recommend this novel. There's not really much I can criticise it for. It's quite light on the science fiction elements. There's not a lot of time spent focusing on the time travel technology. Even though that's central to the plot premise, we learn very little about what it actually is or how it's supposed to work. So it is that might put some readers off, but if you're primarily an SF reader, but honestly, I don't think of that as a criticism at all. To me, this felt a bit. This novel feels like literary fiction with some sci-fi elements. But anyway, I really enjoyed it, and I think I ought to explore more of Michael Bishop. This is a really great read, probably my best read so far this year, and I'm giving it a score of 4.5 stars. And then next up I read Fearless by Alan Stroud. Okay, so this is quite a recent one because it came out in 2020. And this is a book that was sent to me by the publisher last year. And I actually, I met Alan Stroud not too long ago. I interviewed him for my local science fiction group. And he's a very nice fellow, very easy to talk to. So I got him to sign my copy of his book. I'll show it to you. Oh, there it is. So I'm glad I didn't have to wait too long before reading it. I really like the cover design. It's very colourful, nice spaceship illustration here. And it's got a lovely smooth, soft feel to the paper. So as an aesthetic object, I do like this book. Anyway, When I went into this book, I only really had a vague sense of what to expect. It turned out to be a very intense, hard SF, action-heavy story with quite strong character development and a pretty edge-of-the-seat narrative. It's basically a space opera action thriller with some elements of mystery fiction and military sci-fi. In fact, the tagline on the cover says, "They thought it was a rescue, they didn't expect a war." And that pretty much encapsulates the premise. We have a small crew on board a spaceship around 100 years in the future who receive a distress signal from a mysterious dead ship floating out in space. So they go out to investigate and they get attacked by some unknown entity, and then things escalate from there. And the story is narrated in turn by 3 different POV characters. The main one is Captain Alyssa Shan, who is a very strong-willed character, the lead of the crew, and she undergoes immense pressure during this crisis which unfolds for the crew. And she has quite an interesting backstory. She was born with no legs, which was a major factor in her decision to choose a career in space, where having no legs is not so much a disability as because it actually gives you an advantage in maneuvering in a zero-G environment. So we have quite an interesting disability representation in this novel, but it's by no means a focal point of the story. And then sometimes the perspective shifts to a couple of her crew members. So we've got April Johansson, who is a talented and ambitious communications engineer, who's also pretty headstrong. And then there's Celis, who is a repair technician, and he's got a bit of a gambling problem. He seems to have ended up on this spaceship's crew as a means to run away from his debts on Earth. So it's quite an interesting cast with there's some interesting non-POV characters as well who play quite important roles, and they're all they're all interesting, well-developed characters that and most of them have flaws to some extent, and they're believable characters. So we've got these first-person narrators, and then we get a few nuggets of their backstories, but it never really goes into a lot of detail. All of the focus of the story is on the unfolding drama and the action that takes place as the crew faces an increasingly dire situation. So this has got to be one of the most intense books that I've ever read. Right from the start, there's no let-up in pace, the characters never get a rest, and the reader never gets much of a rest. It almost feels like that the events in this book are occurring in real time as you read it. And in that sense, it kind of reminds me a little bit of watching 24. So it's got that same kind of intensity. So that may not appeal to everyone. You do have to be in the right mood to read it, to enjoy it, I think. It's not a cozy read you can relax to, but I did enjoy it. I think Alan Stroud's writing is very polished, it's engaging, and the hard SF elements add a layer of detail to the narrative that makes it feel quite believable. There's a lot of technical detail here, but he doesn't overdo it. It's just enough to give it a layer of realism, which I don't usually come across in space opera, or at least in a lot of the space opera that I've read. So it's a very solid novel. I think if I'm going to criticize it for anything, I felt a little bit let down by the ending, which felt very sudden and left a lot of questions unanswered. So clearly the story is not complete, and the publisher wants me to read the sequel, which fortunately I do have. Resilience, which is this book here. Okay, so I fully intend to read Resilience soon, but it doesn't. This book doesn't work so well as a standalone, which might frustrate some readers, but I really want to know what happens next. But overall, I can definitely recommend this book, especially if you like hard SF space opera or military sci-fi. So I'm giving Fearless a score of 4 stars. And then the next book I'm going to talk about is Children of Ruin by Adrian Tchaikovsky. Okay, so this is the sequel to Children of Time, which was one of my favourite reads last year. And you should definitely read Children of Time first, as this is very much a follow-up and a companion piece to the first book. I can't say that I enjoyed this one as much as the first book, but it was still a worthwhile read with some impressive sci-fi ideas and world building. So the story in Children of Ruin, it builds on the same basic idea that we came across in Children of Time. We've got a distant future space opera in which Earth civilization has collapsed and humanity has spread out to the stars. And just like book 1, we've got another case of a terraforming project on a far-off exoplanet. And once again, another animal uplift experiment. So in the last book, it was the spiders on Kern's world that evolved into an intelligent sentient race. And in this book, it's octopuses. So it's the Rus Khalifi virus again, working its magic. And we have 2 main narrative threads in this book. So I won't go into a lot of detail. I'll just say that one of those narratives is set in the past, in which we follow the development of the Octopus Uplift program on an ocean planet, and we witness the rise of their civilization. And the other narrative takes place thousands of years later, in which humans and their spider allies from Kern's world come into contact with this octopus civilization. So I won't say any more than that about the plot. I think this is a novel that you best go into without knowing too much detail, without knowing any spoilers. But you do need to read Children of Time first, because that will put everything into context. So there are a lot of things I liked about this book. Once again, Adrian Tchaikovsky shows he's a very talented writer, and he explores some very captivating sci-fi ideas. And principally for me, I think the idea of sentient octopuses is really interesting. They're pretty fascinating as a species, so the idea of uplifting them into an advanced race is a really intriguing thought experiment, I think. Even if this principle of how this is achieved is basically a bit of a rehash of what we saw in the first book. But as a species, the octopuses are so fundamentally different on a biological level to both the spiders and the humans that we're familiar with from the series. So, for example, I like the way that the author conceives of the octopus's decentralized nervous system as distinct to other creatures, other beings. Each individual has 2 cerebral systems known as their crown and their reach. And the crown is basically the brain, the central brain, which symbolizes what we might think of as the self, while the reach is basically the sub-brain in each arm of the octopus. And the reach kind of functions as a semi-autonomous component. So you can imagine this has quite a profound impact on cognition and the way these creatures perceive the world and interact with it. And they're also a highly emotional species that communicate visually through colours and patterns. So in a way, they're stranger and even more inscrutable than the spiders. It's a wonder if cross-species communication will ever be possible. But that said, I don't think the octopus social structure that Tchaikovsky creates is quite as interesting or as complex as the spider society of Kern's world. And this whole side of the story doesn't feel quite as compelling as Children of Time for me. I mean, that's not a major issue. I still enjoyed reading about them. But I do think another thing that holds me back from rating this book higher is the pacing. So this is quite a slow burn of a novel, and sometimes it did drag a bit. It felt like a longer read than the first book, and that's even though Children of Time actually has a higher page count. So yeah, it felt a bit uneven in that sense. Maybe it's just that Children of Time set the bar so high. It's such a good book. It's so crammed full of wonderful sci-fi ideas and, a great story. It's kind of inevitable that the sequel would never be able to live up to that same standard. But overall, there's still plenty to like about Children of Ruin. It's very thought-provoking. It's intelligently written. There are plenty of interesting sci-fi ideas. There's also a few enjoyable horror elements that I thought were done very well. It just didn't blow me away like the first book did. So I'm giving it a score of 3.5 stars. I'm definitely looking forward to starting the third book in the trilogy soon, Children of Memory. So that completes the book review trio. The book which I'm reading at the minute is Machine Vendetta, excuse me, by Alistair Reynolds. So this is a new release, and it's the third book in the Prefect Dreyfus Emergency trilogy. So I will be reviewing this book soon. I'll probably just do a standalone review for this before I do I choose my next 3 books to read for the next book review trio. That's all for today. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you again soon.